Hey everybody, it's the Wednesday after the 19th Sunday after Pentecost, and it's time for another Wednesday Word. Today I want to return us to Paul's letter to the Philippians, and particularly I want to talk a little bit about one of the aspects of the passage that was assigned for this past Sunday, from Philippians chapter 4. Right in the middle of that selection, Philippians chapter 4, verses 1 through 9, we find Paul writing these words to the church at Philippi: "Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say, rejoice." It might seem odd to you to focus on rejoicing or joy in a time like the one that we're living through. There's a lot of anxiety in the air about the upcoming election, about the continually climbing case numbers of COVID-19. There's a lot to be anxious about this week. So what does joy have to do with this? I think first, it's helpful to remember that Paul wrote this letter to the Philippians from a prison cell. Scholars seem to have nailed down the idea that Paul was writing from the city of Ephesus, where he had been imprisoned during his missionary journeys. And it was from that prison cell that Paul wrote a number of his letters, but especially this one to the Philippians. And in that context, it might seem odd, but the concept of joy shows up throughout this brief letter. It's mentioned several times in pretty much every chapter of the letter to the Philippians. And you might wonder how it is that Paul was able to talk so much about joy in the context of imprisonment. I think this sounds weird to us because we so often confuse joy with happiness when they're really two separate things. Happiness is something that we experience depending on our circumstances. We might be happy because somebody came to visit us. We might be happy because that test at school came out better than maybe we thought it was going to. We might be happy because it's a sunny day outside. But that happiness can quickly change to something different if our circumstances change. What makes joy different from happiness is that joy comes from a deeper place. Joy is something that's not dependent on what's going on around us. And joy and happiness do not have to happen at the same time. So when Paul writes to the Philippians, and by extension to us, "Rejoice in the Lord always," he's inviting the Philippians and us to consider that deeper well of joy, to consider that joy is something that transcends circumstance, to consider that joy is something that we can experience even in the midst of all the anxiety and turmoil that surrounds us in these days. Looking at the way Paul uses the concept of joy, we find three truths. And I'm drawing these insights from Charles Cussar's commentary on Philippians. But Dr. Cussar writes that joy is, first, something paradoxical. That joy is actually something that we tend to experience in unexpected times and places. So while it seems weird for us to be talking about joy in an anxious time like this is perhaps the sort of time where we have the capability of experiencing joy in ways that we don't expect. Another thing about joy is that it's mutual. Joy is something that is really experienced when it's shared with somebody else. It's sort of hard to be joyful on your own. To really experience joy is to share some common experience or some common insight that brings joy to the fore. And so joy is something that we do together. Rejoicing is something that we do together. And I think that's important during this time when we can feel so isolated, that if we're able to connect with one another in experiencing some measure of joy, it can be an experience that helps us to break out of that feeling of isolation and loneliness. The last thing that Dr. Kusar says about joy that I think is helpful for us is that joy is experienced on a sort of different horizon. If happiness is grounded in today's circumstances, joy is grounded in something more lasting. We can experience joy because it's grounded in the presence and the promise of God. Joy is something that we know deep down because we experience deep down the knowledge that God is with us in these troubling times. And we know that whatever befalls us in our current circumstances, God has the final word. And that final word is victory over the forces of sin and death and the devil that so frequently beset us as individuals and as communities. And so even as we're in that struggle, even as we're in the midst of this anxiety, we can experience joy in the Lord and in one another because we know that the truth of God's promises is stronger than the reality of our circumstances right now. I pray that you and I, during this anxious time, are able to find some measure of that joy, to give thanks for the blessings that we've received even in the midst of the challenges we face, and that together we can look to the future with hope, knowing that God holds the future in the palm of God's hands, and with it, each one of us. Be safe, be well. I look forward to seeing you again next week for another Wednesday Word. Peace to all of you.